And thank you everybody for joining. The Zoom is telling me that we are at over 100 people, 140 people, which is very exciting. So right now I am joining you from Toronto, which is Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe land. The treaty holders is a band called the Mississaugas of the New Credit. And this place, of course, has also been home to many other Indigenous nations and other nations, including the Huron-Wendat, and most recently the Métis. If you don't know whose land you are on, you can go to native-land.ca, which is a link that's in the chat, and check it out. Today we are joined by three former Israeli army soldiers. I'm very excited to have Rafi Silver, Daphna Levitt, and Yom Shamash with us here today. The way this event is going to go is I'm going to give a tiny little bit of context, after which each one of our speakers will speak for about 5 minutes. We will then have a guided discussion, and then after that, we will open it up to the room. So as Aaron said, today's conversation is about the Israeli army. For those who are not aware with the Army's history, the Israeli Defense Forces, as they are known, was formed in 1948 from a number of Jewish militant groups and terrorist groups, including the Haganah, the Etzel, or Irgun as it's known, Lehi, and in September 48, the Palmach has joined as well. As you can imagine, like any new nation, Israel had formed a very strong, very nationalistic narrative about its own army. And the Israeli army, as I grew up in Israel and experienced, was something that was taken for granted in the life of every Israeli Jew. It's assumed that you will serve in the army, and the only question that's really up to you is which unit you will qualify for and which unit you should serve in. However, lately, these kinds of Israeli army narrative formations, such as a recent project by the Israeli National Library to interview the surviving soldiers from the 1948 war. It's a project called Toldot Israel, and you can see those testimonies on toldotisrael.org. Or, for example, in May of this year, the Israeli army itself published its own narrative of its own origin story, and you can see that on their website. The same time, we've seen a rising chorus of critical voices. They're talking about not just about individual war crimes committed by individual soldiers, but about the collective war crimes of the Israeli army and what it does in relation to the dispossession of Palestinians. Very famously, Uri Avneri wrote a critical book called 1948. I made a film in 2013 called On the Side of the Road, in which some veterans of the 1948 war speak about what they've done in the dispossession of 2/3 of the Palestinians who lived in Israel-Palestine in what's known as the Nakba. But just last year, Chaim Bereshit Zabner published a very prominent book called An Army Like No Other, which is a Verso Books publication, which talks about both his personal experience and also the larger picture of what the Israeli army was doing in the years that he served. And this year, a new documentary by Israeli director Avi Mugrabi, titled The First 54 Years, an Abbreviated Manual for Military Occupation, illustrates testimonies from dozens of Israeli soldiers. So this event is definitely, as they say, on brand and very much of the moment. And I'm very, very excited that we're going to hear from, as they say, the horse's mouth, about an army that went from the myth of the most moral army in the world to an army that today is basically considered for investigations of war crimes in Geneva. I wanted to also add that the Israeli army has changed a lot from the kind of army in which our three speakers have served. Today's biggest unit, for example, in the Israeli army is Unit 8200, Army Intelligence. The biggest collaboration with the arms industry is for remote control weaponry. And the biggest trend of the Israeli army is privatization. And so we're seeing that the occupation and Israeli army actions are becoming a lot more about remote control, about mass collection of intelligence and data, and privatization so as to absolve the Israeli government from responsibility for violations. Now, all three of today's speakers served in the Nahal, and I will start by inviting our first speaker, Daphna Levitt, to take the stage. Daphna was born in Israel and was an enthusiastic Zionist who served in the, as I said, in Nahal Corps on the border with Egypt until the 1967 Six-Day War. She was then recruited to serve in the military spokesperson's office, the Intelligence Corps, as a press liaison officer to attend to and escort foreign journalists to sensitive locations. She has written several books. Her most recent book came out last year, and it's called Wrestling with Zionism, Jewish Voices of Dissent, which came out, as I said, last year. Daphna, take it over.
Thank you. So I'm in Nova Scotia, which is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmahi, and I don't ever pronounce that correctly. Yeah, so I think I'm the oldest in terms of the chronology of service in the Army, because I served during the time and a little before the Six-Day War. It was interesting because I'm in the process of moving, and although you don't want to really hear about my private life, when I was unpacking certain boxes, honestly, I ran across my Nahal tags and my bars from serving in the military spokesman office. So I thought it was kind of interesting that this is the day that I'm talking about this. When I served in the Nahal, and I don't know how many of you know what the Nahal is, but it's a sort of a volunteer force, which, I mean, it's part of the military, but you serve a longer basic training, and your entire time is serving on some sort of border community. When I was in the Nahal at the time, there was an incident of friendly fire shooting, and someone very close to me was killed by friendly fire. I've always wondered what the term friendly fire actually meant, because it wasn't very friendly. But I think that the enthusiasm that we all had to serving our country and making sure that the God that we had replaced, the God of Zionism, was kept intact and guarded and protected against all these hostile forces around us. After the Six-Day War broke out, I was asked to serve, as Leah said, in the military spokesman office, and I escorted journalists, among them Walter Cronkite, some of you of my generation might remember him, to the Allenby Bridge, where I could see the flight of many Palestinians out of Israel, and the mythology that was then created by the military spokesman office to tell a story that was different from what I actually saw. It's very hard to believe in what you are told when you were there and see something else. There were several other incidents that occurred that diminished my enthusiasm for the greatest army ever, and for all armies, really. One was when I started to study at Tel Aviv University. It was a time when Nahum Goldman, who used to be head of the Jewish Congress, decided to go try to talk peace. And Golda Meir refused to let him go, because speaking peace to any of the Arab nations was considered treason. And I was sitting in Golda Meir's backyard, along with several of my fellow student protesters who wanted peace at all costs, because we had seen too many incidents of young people being killed by this pernicious enemy. And we were sprayed by blue dye. Later in my life, this was tear gas, but at that time it was blue dye, which you couldn't actually remove from your clothing or your hands. And it was easy for the police to then arrest you on the basis of disrupting the peace. There were several other incidents that occurred during the time close to the Six-Day War where I was completely disillusioned. I don't know how much time I have to speak about all these incidents, but I think that that's about that's about sums up the process that began and then accelerated. I volunteered over many years with several Israeli peace movements and peace organizations in Israel, including Physicians for Human Rights, which went to service clinics around the occupied territories. And I realized that the idea that I was an Israeli and that people were afraid of me was probably the most traumatic. So that's what I have to say about the experience of disillusionment from serving in this army to becoming active in the peace movement.
Thank you so much, Daphna, for that skeletal outline. I'm looking forward to delving deeper in there. But first, I would like to welcome our next speaker. Yom Shamash was also born in Israel at the age of 6. His family moved to Brazil. He returned to Israel in 71 as a member of Shomer HaTza'ir and settled in Kibbutz Zikim, south of Ashkelon. He served in the Israeli army unit Nachal as well, and was in the Sinai in the Yom Kippur War in 1973. He currently lives in Vancouver, where he is a very active IJV Vancouver member. So take it away, Yom.
Good evening. My trajectory from IDF to IJV was neither fast nor easy. In fact, it was rather painful. Let me tell you a little bit about my family. I have Mizrahi Middle Eastern roots. My mother's family is from Aleppo, Syria. My father's family is from Jerusalem and Iran. I was born in Israel. At the age of 6, my family ended up in Brazil. I lived in Belo Horizonte, attended Jewish school for 4 years, and joined the left-wing Zionist Shomer HaTza'ir youth movement in the Jewish club where I used to play soccer. In Brazil, everything starts with soccer. In 1971, I returned to Israel with the Shomer HaTza'ir group to Kibbutz Zikim. And I remember very well the prevailing thinking in Israel then. 4 years after the victory of 1967, Israelis were quite confident. Egypt, the most powerful enemy Israel had, was neutralized. We were strong. We had conquered Sinai, Gaza, the West Bank, the Golan, all in 6 days. I had absorbed this attitude and I felt very secure in my little world. Even during the time of my initial training, what they called Tironut, and service in the Sinai for 6 months, things were very quiet. It was terrifically boring, the Sinai, because nothing happened for 6 months. And then the war of 1973 literally exploded, caught everyone by surprise. On October 13, 1 week after the war started, my unit was literally decimated. This traumatic experience was the beginning of my transformation. And then I started asking questions. In that war, Israel lost 2,700 soldiers. What did they die for? Defending the Sinai? People who have served in Sinai know that Sinai is basically a big box, sandbox, stretching for miles. There's nothing there to defend. But what I didn't know in 1973 was that for several months prior to the war, Israel's then Prime Minister Golda Meir had rejected numerous initiatives by Egypt's then President Anwar Sadat to negotiate a peace deal. So here are the questions. Was it worth it holding on to the Sinai? Especially since in the end, Israel wound up returning it. The same could be said about Lebanon. More than 1,200 Israelis died in Lebanon from 1982 to 2000. Was it worth it? And I think we really owe to the parents, we have to ask the parents of those soldiers who lost their lives this question. And I wonder what they would say. I'm not talking about the number of Palestinians who lost their lives in South Lebanon, approximately 15,000. So the whole premise of Zionism, at least the one I was brought up with, was that Israel would be a safe haven for Jews around the world, safe from anti-Semitism. Yet, since 1967, when the map of Israel fundamentally changed, we had the war of attrition, we have the South Lebanon Palestinian insurgency from 71 to 82, we have the Yom Kippur War, we have the occupation of Lebanon from 82 to 2000, we have the first and second Intifada, we had the Lebanon War in 2006, and since 2008, we had 4 wars in Gaza. So again, my question is Israel really the safest place for Jews? So those are the questions that brought me to where I am today. In 1988, Tarachansky, one of the founders of Yesh Gvul, gave a talk organized by Jews for Justice in Vancouver. I knew Peretz. He was a member of my kibbutz. I attended, and I was invited to join Jews for Just Peace. I had finally found in Vancouver like-minded Jews. I joined then, and I'm still here now.
Thank you, Yom. And our third speaker is Rafi Silver, who was born in the United States and immigrated to Israel in 1971. He was drafted into the Israeli army in 74 and served in the Army Reserves up until 1996. He's a former member of a kibbutz as well and a retired social worker. He immigrated to Canada in 2001 and now lives in Montreal, where he is not only an active member of IJV, but also sits on the National Steering Committee. Take it away, Rafi. Oh, you're muted.
Okay, let's try again. Thank you, Leah, and everybody else that's Yom and Daphna as well, and all those that are joining us from many different parts of this country and other countries across the world. My personal journey, as Leah mentioned, is I immigrated to Israel in 1971. I came from a household that was very Zionistic, very strongly identified with being very proud Jews. Israel was, from the time I was a very small child, was a central part of our household and our growing up. For me, it was a way to express my Judaism. We were not a religious family, somewhat a little traditional, I guess you could say, but Zionism in Israel gave me a purpose, gave me a direction. And so in 1971, I immigrated to Israel alone, without any family. I was involved with Habunim, a kibbutz youth movement, with the goal of settling on a kibbutz somewhere, and eventually joined a Garin, a group of American and Canadian youth who were destined to become part of a kibbutz, a new kibbutz that was going to be established in the Golan Heights. I went into the army a year after the Yom Kippur War. I had witnessed the war as a civilian, having lived in a kibbutz up on the Syrian border. And the day that the war broke out, Syrian planes were flying overhead, dropping bombs on neighboring kibbutzim. So I was, as I said, a young man at the time. I was about 19, 20 years old, and wanted to do my part, was caught up in the myths of that Daphna mentioned about the Israeli army, was caught up in the seeing my friends go off to battle, many of whom were in the Sinai where Yom was, but not really understanding what was happening. I mean, little by little, though, as I look back and reflect back on my own trajectory and how I got to IJV 30 or more, 50, almost 50 years later, I can see from this perspective how my belief system had slowly been chipped away by the reality of what was happening in Israel and Palestine, by what was happening around me in the geopolitical sense. And I remember very well the peace offers coming from Anwar Sadat before the Yom Kippur War that Yom mentioned. And then through my own military service, I was eventually assigned, I guess you could say, or sent to Gaza. I was sent to the West Bank on numerous occasions, different places each time, refugee camps, guarding settlements, etc., protecting racist, extreme right-wing settlers. All the time, little by little, my confidence, my belief in the system in which I had devoted so much of my life was, like I say, was being chipped away. I think what eventually happened, what I can remember very clearly, a moment in which I finally threw my hands up and said, no more, I can't do this anymore. I had been making excuses for years about the Palestinians did this, the Palestinians did that, Israel's not so bad. I had been closing my eyes to the obvious, but the truth was coming through. It was shining through, and I couldn't hide from it anymore. And I couldn't hide from my own participation in the system and supporting the system. Finally, the incident that occurred that really pushed me out of the country to Canada and eventually to IJV was in 1996. I was serving in my reserve unit. We were stationed just outside a refugee camp on the road between Bethlehem and Hebron. And it was a cold, rainy, wintry, kind of not quite winter, but late November night. And we were just about to be relieved. We were not allowed to go into the refugee camp because it was considered too dangerous and it would be too provocative, until this one night when we did go in. And the reason we went in is that somebody had thrown an object from inside the refugee camp at a passing Israeli bus. The object turned out to be a Molotov cocktail that exploded on the ground behind the bus. The bus didn't even notice, it just kept going. But that was an excuse enough for the army to go into this camp of 10,000 people. And for the actions of one individual, we went in and imposed a collective punishment of over a week on 10,000 people and did not let them out of their houses except for an hour or two a day to get some food, etc. We closed the camp down completely. And on that first night in the camp, we were running through the alleyways, screaming and pushing people back into their homes and imposing this curfew. And my squad was assigned to a particular alleyway, a corner of an alleyway, and we were told to arrest everybody that was coming down the street. And they didn't necessarily even know that a curfew was being imposed. Well, what happened, we started arresting everybody that walked, and it didn't matter if they were 10-year-old children or 80-year-old grandfathers. We arrested them and we put them up against the wall, and it was a dark, rainy night and it was cold, and we were waiting for the interrogators to come to interrogate these people to see if they had perpetrated this crime or knew someone who did. And as I'm standing guarding these people, surrounded in this tiny, very, very overcrowded refugee camp with people looking out their windows from the stories above, etc., feeling quite nervous, obviously, of what we were doing. One of the young boys, couldn't have been more than 10 or 11, who had been standing against actually been squatting, because we had made them squat against the wall for over an hour. He got up because he just couldn't squat anymore, or he had to go to the bathroom or something. And I saw him out of the corner of my eye, and I turned with my finger on the trigger. And I was just about to shoot because I saw this shadow out of the corner of my eye in the middle of a refugee camp at night. And I was scared. And just because of for the grace of God, I didn't pull the trigger. Another soldier yelled at me to stop. And it was at that moment when I finally said enough, that all of the myths that I had been raised upon, all of the excuses that I had made over the years, all of the actions that I had participated in, I said, no more. I can't do this anymore, because I came within a hair's breadth of killing a young child. And so I've finished that was the last year of my Army service. And at that moment, I made a decision to leave the country. Before I finally left, a couple of years later, before I was able to immigrate to Canada, I became very involved with the Israeli Committee against house demolitions, became involved with Peace Now, became involved with other groups that were trying to promote dialogue between Israelis and Palestinians. Eventually moved here, as Leah said, in 2001, and became involved with IJV because for me, this is my home. These are the people that I can, that understand what I am talking about. And there's a purpose here that I didn't find, frankly, in any other place.
Wow. Thank you for that, Rafi. And actually, the last bit there brings me to the first question I wanted to ask Daphna and Yom, to build on what Rafi was saying. If you can share with us maybe a memorable moment from your service, what is kind of the first moment that pops to your mind when you think about that period in your lives? Daphna?
So I think I mentioned being on the Alabi Bridge and seeing the flight of Palestinian was incredibly powerful for me. There were several other incidents along the way, but I've been an activist for many years in Israel with organizations. I don't know if they're all familiar to IJV, but Mahsom Watch and Physicians for Human Rights and B'Tselem. And so there have been so many incidents that have accumulated over the years that for me to draw on one particular incident is hard. Although in the epilogue to my book, Wrestling with Zionism, I write about an incident that is probably the most traumatic. It isn't the only one, but I was with Physicians for Human Rights. We were at a clinic, and there was a little boy who had cut off his ear, and his mother was desperate to get into the ambulance with the little boy, who must have been all of 5 or 6, who was screaming. His head was wrapped in a bloody towel. And the ambulance driver wouldn't let the mother, because she was dangerous, apparently, onto the ambulance. So she had to walk all the way around this various large checkpoint area while the little boy was taken by himself, screaming and in awful pain, to the hospital. I mean, this was an incident that forever tarred me. I don't think I could ever look at an Israeli soldier in quite the same way again. And this was a paramedic. So there were several incidents. I really can't choose one, but yeah, that was one.
Fair enough. And Yom, did you have any moment you'd like to retell?
Unmute. Oh, again, there wasn't one particular incident that triggered, but there were several, like Daphna said. As I was thinking out for this event, something came back to me. I was thinking, and I haven't thought about it for many, many years, but it stuck to me during the Tironut, the initial training. We were in the Haggadah Maravi, the West Bank, and it was dark, it was at night. They got us walking every night and marching. And I recall that as we were walking at night, not seeing anything, I noticed myself, I was stepping on vegetables. And I couldn't understand what the hell we're doing there. Why would we be stepping on a vegetable garden? And only years later, I thought again about it. And I said, we were stepping on people's gardens. This is Palestinian farmers. And that's where we used to walk. Now, I don't know if that was government policy or whether it was the officer's policy, but certainly somebody made that decision. It really stayed with me sort of inside. And I just remember about it for this event. But really the most powerful event for me was the trauma of being, that experience where my unit was decimated. People were wounded, some people died, friends, colleagues, and that stays with you. And it's, the war was in 73. I joined Jews for a Just Peace in 1988. From 73 to 88, for 15 years, I didn't want to talk about the war, didn't want to talk about Israel, I didn't want to deal with it. And it took me that long to process the trauma and the experience and the questions and so on.
Wow. And before we go into the trauma piece, I just wanted to go back a little bit to you guys' childhoods. For Rafi in the US and for Daphna and Yom in Israel. Do you remember as a kid meeting Israeli soldiers or Israelis in uniform? Or if you don't, do you remember what you heard about Israeli soldiers? Because I remember when I was a little girl in Israel, every year the Israeli army would send soldiers to our school. And they were always, even though obviously uniformed soldiers are everywhere on the streets, meeting them face to face, it only amplified for us the reverence. And I was just wondering if you could share any stories that you have about meeting Israelis in uniform when you were kids. Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead, Yom.
No, go ahead.
So my sister was always, still is, 8 years older. So I knew her as a soldier. Yeah, I mean, the soldier was something we always looked up to. But in Israel, in high school, you have, it's called a pre-military, it was, I don't know if it still exists, the Gadna, and that would be like military training for high school students. And it was all in preparation for our participation in this glorious, heroic effort that Trumpeldor, one of our Israeli heroes, said that it's good to die for our country. So since it was good to die for our country, the vehicle of death was obviously being a soldier. And that was sort of the glory of our nation. We didn't have God so much because we were very secular, at least in Tel Aviv, where I went to high school. We had very few religious people in our high school, none actually. And so the God that we replaced him with was Zion. And the idea that we would serve this country and defend it against all the evils that are lurking in the shadows. And they all are wearing Arab clothing.
Wow. And Yom?
Yeah, I mean, soldiers in Israel were really respected and so on. In my kibbutz, for example, Kibbutz Akim, there was a young man. He was actually the first Ben Kibbutz. He was born in the kibbutz, the first child born in the kibbutz, and he was wounded, I don't know exactly when, but he lost a leg. And we had so much respect for him. He was admired, he was revered, and that's how soldiers are viewed in Israel.
And what about you, Rafi? What did you hear about Israeli soldiers as a kid in the US?
I was growing up in the US, and I remember I was a teenager during the 1967 war, and there was a big event at the local synagogue that we belonged to, talking about, Israel, the Israeli army needs our support. It's the most moral army in the world. The famous quote from Golda Meir that said, she hates the Arabs because they make us shoot they make us shoot them. We're good. And, it was those kind of myths that were being spread among the Jewish community in which I grew up, and everywhere among, the Jewish families at the local synagogue, where, the Hebrew school that I went to, that's what we studied, all about the glorious Israeli army. And that whenever we would meet an Israeli who came to town for whatever reason, we would look up to this ex-soldier, this former soldier, almost like a movie star in a sense. There was this certain idealization of what an Israeli soldier is. He carries a gun, not because he wants to, but because he has to. And yeah, that's what it was like.
Yes, here in Canada, there's certainly quite a homogenous perspective on Israeli soldiers in mainstream Jewish institutions. So I can definitely see how you had that experience in the United States. Now, Daphna mentioned this a little bit, and I was just wondering about Rafi and Yom. For you, when did you start thinking about what you were going to do in the Israeli army, which unit you were going to be part of? What were some of your deliberations? Could you talk a little bit about those 5-part tests that you have to do in order to get classified with the number and then assigned a unit? And Yom, why don't you go first?
Well, I was with a group of Brazilians in the kibbutz, and we weren't too much into the army. We knew we had to do it. And some of my friends found ways to not go into the front lines and so on. Unfortunately, I had no problem. I had what they call profile, best profile, which is 97. And I had no choice but be a chayal kravi, like a combatant soldiers. But I wasn't at all interested in doing well in the army, proving myself. I really was. I was a terrible soldier. But I knew I had to do it. And I said, okay, that's part of being in Israel. I'll do my bit. And so I was, as much as I didn't want to do much, I didn't really like the army. But you just accept it. It's part of life. And even, I was not 18 when I went in the army. I was 21. So I was a little later, and I was serving with 18 years old in Nahal. So there is the fact that I grew up in Brazil. I don't think I absorbed that Israeli mentality, and I was more Brazilian in that sense. Let me do it the easiest way I can get over it. And that was my mentality at the time.
And Rafi, when did you start training for the army, or even thinking about which unit you wanted?
So for me, it was a decision that was decided when I decided to immigrate to Israel with my garim. Like I said, it was a group of American and Canadian kids. We went together, and all of the boys in the group, some of the girls, but not many, but all of the boys went, we went in together as one group into Nahal. And the discussion was there was never any thought of, how can we avoid this or anything like that. It's no, how can we get into the most elite combat unit that we can get into. And some of us went to paratroopers. I ended up in the tank corps. Others ended up in artillery. Couple of guys, one guy I think became a combat combat medic. So it was, if you were, because of a low profile, because you had some kind of medical condition, if you were not in going to go to a combat unit, but you go to the quartermaster corps, for example, or something like that, that was in a sense a sign of shame. It's like, you got to prove yourself. You got to, get with the program type of thing. So I went in incredibly enthusiastic, and that enthusiasm lasted about 15 minutes after I hit the ground in basic training, and then realized this is not what, I had been led to believe. So it was quite a journey after that. But I was in and I was stuck, and so I did it.
And did you want to add anything, Daphna, to this question? So I wanted to share a little bit of my personal story. In grade 9, a soldier from the IDF came to our school, and I remember she informed us that we're going to start training in Krav Maga, which is close quarter combat. And I just remember being so inspired by the power of this young woman. And I remember she would use examples of what she imagined would be actual examples of Army service to show us how you could get out of a tricky situation. Now, I came of age during the Second Intifada, which was a time of a lot of suicide bombings. And I remember she would use examples that, even though I had no critical thought about the IDF at all, didn't seem to make any sense to me. Like, she would say, imagine you're walking down the street in Tel Aviv and a suicide bomber with a suicide belt on grabs you by the arm. How do you get away from it? And I remember just thinking, like, why would they grab me by the arm if they could just blow up? And I was wondering if we can delve a little bit on this little point. Were there any aspects, and I imagine for you, Daphna, as someone whose job it was to be the mouthpiece of the Israeli army, but were there any moments that are not really about external reasons for critique, but just internal messages that you were getting from the army itself, that even before you became politicized on Palestine, didn't really seem to make any sense to you, or maybe have just made a little crack in the wall of nationalist fervor?
I think I keep repeating myself. I don't know if I am. I think that the difference between what I saw as I was escorting the foreign press, who always wanted to go to places where the censorship forbade them to go, or wanted to produce articles that the censorship didn't want them to produce, because at the time the censorship was a lot stronger. I don't know what it's like today, but I found that it was very hard to understand why they weren't allowed to tell the truth, because I always thought that the point of reporting was, or naively thought that the point of reporting was to inform the world of what was actually happening. And here was a narrative that suddenly wasn't exactly as I saw it. So this maybe was one other of the many things that kept repeating themselves to me and made no sense. And so they made part of the disillusionment. There were also, at the same time, there was in Israel a surge of poets and playwrights and other artists who were coming up with things that contradicted what the military and the government was saying. And I noticed that the military was always saying, or the government was always in agreement with the military. And I always found it very frustrating, because what they were agreeing about had very little to do with what I was seeing. And so over time, that became a major torment to me, because I too had been a gung-ho Zionist. I mean, I really wanted to serve my country. I really wanted to not be selfish. I really wanted to be brave. Obviously, I wasn't in combat like some of the other people here, but I was near it. I was very close to the combat zone, especially when Some of the braver reporters wanted to go to places that were dangerous. They were very heavily protected, though. So yeah, that's really my story.
There's one comment I'd like to make. Leah, is that okay?
Yes, go ahead.
The Israeli soldiers are asked to do all kinds of horrible things, especially in the territories. Break into homes in the middle of the night, treat people really badly, and so on. The only way you can do such a thing is that you have to be convinced in your own mind that that person over there is not like you. He is less human than you. He is not deserving of freedom, he's not deserving of rights, and so on. And that's the only way you can be a soldier. And in order to reach that point, there's a whole brainwashing that has to go to bring you to that point, so you become a good soldier. A good soldier is an obedient soldier. An obedient soldier will do whatever is asked. A good soldier does not ask questions. And that's, I mean, one can generalize, say any army is like that. You know, it's not particular to Israel, but it's definitely true in regards to the IDF. That's the only way you can do certain things, if you are absolutely convinced that the other is not like you.
Yeah. Rafi?
Completely agree with Yom. He hit the nail on the head. For me, when you talk about, or Daphna mentioned about the cracks in the mythology of for me, it didn't come from the government, which I had always been suspicious of and skeptical about anyway. It came from the fellow soldiers. And I'd been with some of the same guys for years. And I had seen this, what Yom was kind of, I think what Yom was referring to is this, the level of insensitivity and just total disregard for the other, in this case, the Palestinian, grows over time. And to a point where you don't see them. You don't see them as human beings. I remember one time, I keep coming back to that last incident, my last time that I did Miluim, reserve duty, outside this refugee camp for a month, I was there. And one time when we were patrolling inside the camp while it was under curfew, the families would leave the doors open, but they weren't allowed to go outside. And I remember walking by this one house, and there was a little girl there. She couldn't have been more than 3 or 4, with curly hair and eyes like saucers. And she looked just like my daughter, just like my daughter. And I almost, I stopped. I couldn't breathe for a second. It's like thinking, what, you know, my daughter could be inside the door staring at a soldier, totally terrified. And I had mentioned this incident to one of my Army buddies after I got back to the base. And he said, what's your problem? Why do you see them? They're not like us. They're nothing. And that was another huge crack. And I saw that time and time again from soldiers, from police, at the checkpoints, at the entrance to refugee camps, at the border crossings where I had served in Gaza a couple of times. Yeah, and the insensitivity had grown to a point, I think, today, where the Israeli youth, who it's now 54 years of occupation, you can't keep someone in the gutter without being in the gutter yourself. And what does it do but destroys your own moral fiber? And that, to me, is one of the greatest tragedies that is happening for Israelis. There are different kinds of tragedies, obviously, for Palestinians, but for Israelis, for Israel, that's, you know, the days of the myth of 1948, the War of Independence and all that, they're long gone. And now this is where we have come to, which is so sad and so tragic.
Yeah, you remind me of a very important quote from Baldwin, the author, James Baldwin, who said that when a police officer holds a cattle prodder against an innocent woman, what he's committing is atrocious. But in some ways, what happens to him when he picks up the cattle prodder is equally atrocious. Now, to pick up on the point that Yom brought forward, you know, it takes a lifetime to condition a child into being a soldier. But it only takes a few minutes to collapse a lifetime of conditioning when that soldier sees through the conditioning. There's a great Israeli documentary by Eyal Sivan called Iskol that kind of shows the trajectory of how the Israeli education system really brings out the soldier in every child. And I will share a link to that documentary right now in the chat. Now, for me, when I was growing up, whenever we did hear about them, which we almost never did, we only heard about Arabs. I actually didn't hear the term Palestinians, Palestinian, or Palestine until I came to Canada to do my undergrad. And I was wondering if you guys could talk a little bit about the first time that you heard about Palestine, or maybe the first time you had an interaction with a Palestinian person. And why don't we start with Daphna? Of course, I mean, not as a soldier.
Well, I mean, I had heard the word Palestine many times growing up. I, in fact, was born in Palestine because I was born before 48. Don't tell anybody. And so was my mother. And then so was my grandfather. So we were all Palestinians, I guess. And then there was Yasser Arafat and the Palestinians. So that word came up a lot in my life. To actually have met Palestinians was a whole different thing, because when the word apartheid is used for Israel, it is so accurate. Most Israelis to this day will live maybe less than a kilometer away from a Palestinian house and will never, ever meet them. There was a time when Palestinian labor was imported into Israel much more easily, and that was the only way that Israelis would interact with Palestinians, but there's very little interaction. So for me, it was only as a result of the activities that I did as a peace person, where in some various roles, like with Ta'ayush, we would go and deliver water to Palestinian villages whose wells had been drained by settlers under the supervision of soldiers. So these were the times where I actually interacted with Palestinians. I think the most memorable, if you give me another second, was when I went into one of the communities where, and I don't remember the name of it right now, we went with Physicians for Human Rights, and there was a little girl there who was sitting waiting for her mother or her father to be treated. And with my very limited Arabic, I was trying to reassure her that everything would be fine. And then she looked at me and she asked me where I was from. And when I said I was from Tel Aviv, the shock in her face, like, oh my God, you're the enemy. I'm terrified. She had to run away. This was one of those moments where, you know, you kind of hold the mirror to your face. It's quite uncomfortable.
100%. Do you guys want to add anything about how it was for you to meet a Palestinian for the first time, or?
Yeah, I mean, it was very interesting because, yeah, of course, I met Palestinians during my army service, but that's a totally different kind of interaction than what we're talking about. But a normal human interaction between people, I only started to meet Palestinians after I finished my military service, by the mid 90s. And mind you, I'd been living in the country for decades by then. Okay, so it's quite amazing when you think about it. And to Daphna's point, everybody in Israel lives within you know, a stone's throw of a neighbor or a border or someplace of Palestinians, but doesn't see them and doesn't even think to see them. Most don't. I mean, the peace activists do. Anyway, I became involved in the peace movement in different organizations and whatnot, and had the good fortune to be able to go back to Gaza as a civilian, as a guest of a Palestinian NGO, and walk through Jabalia refugee camp, where a few years before I had been in a soldier's uniform, but now I was in civilian clothes. And it was amazing what I had seen that I did not see as a soldier, because either I couldn't see it or I didn't want to see it. But now I could really see the conditions under which people were living, especially in Gaza, which is incredible poverty, open sewers, you know, overcrowding. It's difficult to explain. And then I started to connect the dots. These were people that used to live in Ashkelon or Beersheba or Jaffa or other places that, through no fault of their own, and these were the children, grandchildren, or great-grandchildren of people who had been kicked out by the glorious Israeli army. Now I was seeing them. And what astounded me time and time again was, I did not personally, I did not hide the fact that I was an Israeli. I did not hide, and every Palestinian would know that, oh, you're an Israeli man, you were in the army at one time. And I did not hide the fact that I had been in the same refugee camp a few years before as a soldier. But I was not met with the hostility and the hatred that I was expecting, okay? Because I was there as their guest, okay? And they, you know, there was an opportunity, and it began, and it was life-changing for me to begin this human connection with people I was told want to throw me into the sea, want to put me in a gas chamber, you know, just hate me for who I am. It wasn't that way at all. It wasn't that way at all.
Yeah. And Yom, did you have an experience like that?
Now, what's amazing is that I lived in half an hour from Gaza. My kibbutz, you could actually see Gaza from my kibbutz. And every morning there will be a truck of Palestinians coming to work in the kibbutz, mostly in construction or during the season, the picking season. They used to come, we used to see them. And looking back, it's as if they were invisible. There was absolutely no contact. And I lived in Israel for, you know, after I went back to Israel for over 3 years, and I had no contact whatsoever with any Palestinian, not even with Arabs who lived in Israel. I mean, there's almost 2 million Palestinians in Israel, and I don't remember ever talking to a Palestinian in Israel.
Wow.
Israeli.
It's like me. Yeah, it's like me.
I mean, they're almost as if they're invisible. We had no contact, and it's amazing. I met Palestinians in Vancouver. That was the first time I talked to a Palestinian.
When you were growing up, did you hear about Israelis refusing the draft and paying various levels of severity in terms of the punishment of imprisonment or other kinds of punishment for refusing to serve?
No, that was just unimaginable until the first war in Lebanon. And I remember this must have been in 1982 with Israel's invasion of Lebanon that went all the way to West Beirut, and there was a huge uproar in the media about this one tank commander. I think his name was Eli Geva or something. Was very famous, where he refused. He was in Beirut, you know, leading a tank battalion or something, and he said, "I can't do this anymore." That was huge. So when I was in the army, it was almost unheard of. There were occasional, by the time after the first Intifada in the mid-90s, etc., you would hear occasionally about a soldier who would refuse, but there wasn't a movement at the time, not like there is now.
I think also for women, at the time that I served, there was a way out, which would be to get married or to be pregnant or to declare yourself a religious believer. But for the community in which I lived, that was so shameful to not serve or to even want to not serve. So in the community that I existed in Israel, there is no way that any woman would not serve. That was considered absolutely an abomination. And then later, many years later, one of the groups that I actually support wholeheartedly are those who are refusing to serve. So it's kind of interesting how that came about, which may be a positive sign because it means that today's youth are not completely brainwashed by the mythology. That's my hope.
Rafi or Yom?
I agree with everything that was said.
Yeah, it was for me also. I mean, when I was in the army, it would be unthinkable not to serve. It's just
What
you didn't do it. You didn't do it.
Yeah.
one thing, I'll just a quick comment that absolutely shocked me. About 2 years ago, I was watching what was happening in the border of Gaza with the march, and there was those soldiers totally protected with all the gear hidden behind a mound of sand, literally practicing target shooting on Palestinians' legs. And it shocked me so much because none of the soldiers were under any threat. The Palestinians were all inside Gaza protesting, throwing stones, true, but nobody was under any threat. And there was this, and I understand even the dynamic that happens among soldiers. I experienced it during the war, where there's that competition, who can do more, who can shoot more, or, there's that bravado, Israeli bravado of let's prove ourselves. This is our chance.
Yeah.
But I was thinking about that. What, the mentality, how brainwashed you must be to shoot into the leg of an unarmed young man, maiming them for life. And this was happening in huge numbers, over 10,000 people in a matter of a few days, who at no moment threaten your life. This just shows the power of the brainwashing. I keep making that point again and again. But it really shocked me and upset me so much.
And yet, despite of the massive, the investment in conditioning Israelis from kindergarten all the way up to the time they're 18, 19 to serve, there's still a movement of Israelis who refuse to serve, the Shministim, the refuseniks. I just wanted to send our love to Shachar Peretz and Rav Aviv, who are currently in jail for the third time for refusing to serve in the Israeli army. I also wanted to share that anybody who wants to know more about testimonies of Israelis soldiers can check out both Avi Mughrabi's documentary, The First 54 Years, and Breaking the Silence, which is an Israeli organization that gives testimony to Israeli soldiers about the war crimes that they committed. Now, just to finish up before I open it up to our audience, I just wanted to ask you guys, knowing that there are people like Shachar Peretz and Rav Aviv, if you could speak to yourself when you were 18, 19, what would you say? Daphna?
I think Rafi wanted to say something, so maybe you go first, Rafi, and then I'll answer.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to say, and I'll get to your question in a second, Leah, but I was going to say a comment to what Yom was talking about using Palestinians as target practice from a totally protected area and under absolutely no threat. It's what I noticed in my experience from the early 70s up until the mid 90s is that there has been this progression of, and I talked about it earlier, about this increasing level of insensitivity. I remember an incident when I was in Gaza in reserve duty, stationed in the Jabalia refugee camp, and the army base was on a little hill. And one day a guy came, drove up in a Jeep, a soldier, with a sniper's rifle. And he parked the Jeep inside the base, took out his rifle, and started shooting into the camp. And I said, and I went over, I said, what are you doing? He said, oh, I got orders. I have to kill the stray dogs. I said, are you crazy? There's people down there. He said, what are you talking about? He didn't understand the question. And so the point is that you start out, it's insidious. Okay. It starts out small. It starts out with the small, tiny little humiliations, and it works itself up to we start shooting dogs in the middle of a crowded refugee camp. Can you imagine if a police officer just was walking down the street of Montreal and saw a stray dog and started shooting it in the middle of a crowd? He thought nothing of it. None of the other soldiers thought anything of it. And then the logical progression is what Yom was describing, is to start shooting people from a distance of hundreds of meters away that can't hurt you, even if they wanted to. There's no way they can get to you. And so that to me was such a strong reminder of where we're going. Where is it going to end up? I have no idea. So I'm sorry, I went off.
Right.
And
That's
just
all
to-
right. And Mike, just to go back to the question, because we do have quite a few audience questions as well. If you could speak to your 18, 19-year-old version of yourself, what would you say?
Me?
Sure.
Me? I don't know what I would say to myself, because I really wasn't listening. I mean, I really wasn't, I don't think I could have gotten through to myself at that age. And I think one of the themes that I have come to realize, that governments have chosen the age of 18 for recruitment is a very good time to choose. Because when you're 18, and I'm sorry to anybody who's 18 on this program, but when you're 18, first of all, you feel invincible to a large extent. And second, you're so convinced that you know stuff, and that all these older people who are telling you things don't know anything. They're all talking through whatever. And so I don't know if I could have gotten through to myself. I don't know if I could. I really don't.
Yeah.
I would say that, we honestly became Zionists because all you had to do to be Zionist when you're young was just breathe the air around you. I mean, there's nothing else around. There was nobody, at least I wasn't exposed to anything different than that. So we all reached that point, honestly, just by being around our families, our communities, and absorbing all the values that are brought to us. And it takes time, it takes courage, and some of us are slower than others. Nowadays, because there's more news that you can read, there are more refuseniks, it's easier to see, yeah, there are others, there are other points of view. But when I was growing up, there was just one point of view. There was nothing else.
Yeah.
And I would, if I was to talk to my 18-year-old or 19-year-old self, I would say, open your eyes. It's all around you. The truth is lying at your feet. It's over your head. It's next to you. It's everywhere. All you have to do is look, and you don't have to be terribly intelligent or terribly introspective or a researcher of any kind. It's all there. And we all refused to look because we didn't want to believe, or we didn't think it was necessary, or we were, you know, as Yom was talking about, just conditioned in such a way that, you know, so to Daphna's point, I doubt if I would have listened to myself, but if that's the advice I could give, that would be it. Open your eyes. It's all right in front of you.
I just think that we don't develop that critical muscle until many years later. It's a problem.
So I just want to remind the audience that if you have any questions or comments, please use the Q&A button below. And I just want to kick off the audience Q&A with a question from Stephen Lowe, who asks, do you still have family in Israel, and what kind of a relationship do you still have with them? And I'll just let anybody who wants to tackle that.
I have family in Israel, but as I said, my family is Mizrahi. And I remember when I visited them in Israel, we went to Jordan to see Petra. And the first reaction was my first cousin said, Petra, Ravim, right? What are you doing there? They're Arab. I mean, Petra is this wonderful place to see, and we're so happy that we experienced it. But that's the attitude of my family in Israel. So I love them. They're very generous people, wonderful. But I also have very close friends who live in a kibbutz near Gaza. A kibbutz that every time there's a war in Gaza, everybody's hiding in the bunkers. So I think part of our problem is that most of us, people our generation, grew up feeling Israel was, we have that emotional connection and affective connection with Israel. And I see there's an intergenerational switch now where the new generation doesn't feel the same way we did. But because of that emotional connection we have with Israel, we are affected by what happens in Israel. And it becomes almost like an obsession. You have to read about it, you have to keep up with everything and so on. So no matter what happens in Israel, we are, as people in my generation, we are very affected by what happens there. And I think it's our responsibility to do something about it.
Did anybody else want to tackle that question, or should I move on to the next one?
I think I'd like to just say that for many years, I always felt that I was an Israeli primarily, and all the other parts of my life that were peripatetic were not really my real self. But more and more, I've come to feel that Israel has been taken away from me by forces that I cannot understand or cannot live with. That the settler community in Israel is as foreign to me as any remote African country that I've never visited. It is so impossible for me to understand my, so to speak, own people, because they're not anymore. So yes, I have family in Israel. Some of them admire me and others think that I'm a traitor to my country. And that hurts, but I have to do this because I can't live in good conscience with myself in that space where myself has to talk to my brain.
And just a follow-up question from Diana. Oh, how do you deal with family or friends who are still very much pro-Zionist? Rafi, maybe if you wanted to take that on.
Don't talk about it. It's just like, you just don't talk about it. There's no point. And so if it's important to maintain a relationship, don't talk about it. It's sad, but it's the truth. I mean, I don't have any family left in Israel anymore. I was married and had some children in Israel, and my youngest daughter left Israel a number of years ago after she successfully avoided the draft and she now lives in Montreal as well. So yeah, it's as Daphna said, it's a country that I don't recognize anymore. It has changed so fundamentally, so in such a huge way over the last 50 years that has been my experience with it. I don't recognize it. I really don't.
Well, a quick moment of IJV promotion. If you do have very pro-Zionist family or family that's on the opposite end from you in terms of Zionism, IJV does do workshops called Beyond Polarized Fetching that give you the tools to do that in a way that is not destructive to those relationships. And going forward with our audience question, just to pick up also where Daphna left off, Abraham Weizfeld was asking, how do you, any of you, define your Jewish identity today if it's not by Israel?
I'll
Rafi?
take that one. Yeah, as I mentioned in my intro, Israel was the center of my Jewish identity, and it has been a very long journey for me because I'm not a religious person. I never really was a religious person. But the way I identify my Jewish identity today is through social action. And that's one of the reasons that I decided to become involved with IJV is I can express my Jewishness through solidarity with oppressed peoples like the Palestinians, and through social action and raising awareness. That's how I define myself.
Anybody else?
I mean,
So I think that my my definition of is really more in terms of the scholars that I read that give me some sense of belonging to whatever it is that's Jewish. If it's a race or a nation, I'm not sure yet. I'm not convinced. People like Martin Buber, people like Gershom Scholem, people like the name suddenly left me, Yeshayahu Leibovitz, people like that for whom the identity is not that Judaism is not nationalism, that Judaism has nothing to do with an army. It has nothing to do with a state that owns, that with an army that owns a state. And these are the scholars and thinkers that I would like to believe are part of my heritage, not the settlers and not the military leaders.
I'll just say that Judaism is so much more than Israel. Yes, Israel is what it is, and I can't divorce myself from Israel because I was born there. I worry about what happens in Israel. I have a connection, both emotional, that gut feeling about Israel. I can't deny it, and I don't want to lose that connection. But Judaism is so much more than that. It is so rich culturally, and that's what sustains, I think, me, and especially the Judaism of the philosophers that Daphna said, Jews who fought for social justice. And that's what sustains, I think, most of us. Mm-hmm. We just can't help not doing anything.
Another question that was asked is, surely you met Israeli soldiers or veterans after you kind of came out as critical, or hopefully you have. What are those conversations like when you talk to other Israeli soldiers?
They're difficult. Go ahead, Rafi.
No. I was just going to say, I don't have those conversations. I mean, the only Israeli soldiers or ex-Israeli soldiers that I encounter are ones that I find here in Canada. I'm not really in touch with any of my old army buddies. There was one that I was very close to that My experience, he had similar experiences to me. And what I saw oftentimes is people would go one way or the other. It's very difficult to remain completely neutral. And so I went left and much more radical, and he went extreme right. And there's no bridge that can, you know, stretch that far across the gap. So that friendship is over.
Thank you, Siddharth, for that question. You know, some folks are wondering, there's an anonymous question about whether it's true that the Israeli Defense Forces, the Israeli Army, recruits people in Canada. Personally, I can certainly say that that is true. There's a number of organizations that work in Canada, even though it's technically illegal. But I was wondering if any of you wanted to add to that question.
I think I was just going to say, I think the whole birthright thing is a way to recruit soldiers from diaspora Jewry, you know, and as well as it's an investment to get these young Jews to eventually write a check to the United Jewish Appeal or something like that later on. But yeah.
So then let's just move on to the next question. And Jenny Steinbeck and Steve Little asked a kind of similar question about this. So if ignorance of the Nakba and the ongoing displacement of Palestinians is at the heart of Israeli denialism, what do you each see is the solution? Daphna?
Wow, a solution. I've only been in this world for several decades, and I don't know if I have the right to have lost hope, but I don't see any solution, really. Maybe there could come, you know, maybe the second coming will actually achieve a solution, but that's not my religion. So therefore, I don't see one. I really don't. Israel is at a point where the demographics are against it, and yet it persists in the same policies that have never worked, which sort of proves Einstein's idea that doing the same thing over and over and over again and expecting a different resolution is crazy. So I don't know how to answer a question like that, but if I come up with one, I'd really like to be rewarded magnanimously for the solution. I don't have it, sorry.
I was gonna, yeah, I agree with you, Daphne. I mean, I don't have a solution either. Having said that, however, I'm not a total pessimist. I mean, I'm quite pessimistic, but I'm not a total pessimist because if I just look at two examples in my own lifespan, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the collapse of apartheid in South Africa, those things at the time, before they happened, nobody thought they were possible. It was just like unimaginable that, oh my God, the Soviet Union is going to fall without a shot being fired, or Nelson Mandela, is going to become in a few years' time president of South Africa. It was totally unimaginable. Having said that, also, you know, I'm not, you know, some starry-eyed optimist that thinks, oh, everybody will just sit around a campfire, sing Kumbaya, and we'll all love each other. That's not going to happen so fast either. But there are certain things that are happening, as you said. The demographics are what they are. There is a de facto one state between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. Israel controls everything in that entire territory of historic Palestine. So eventually, I doubt I'll see it in my lifetime, but maybe in my children or grandchildren's lifetime, there will be some kind of single state, binational state, because the numbers, the system as it is not sustainable. Just as the Soviet Union was not sustainable, just as apartheid South Africa was not sustainable, apartheid Israel is not sustainable.
Yom?
It's been very painful this whole journey for me, and this is one of the things that's painful, is looking at the future. What future there is there? And I reached the painful conclusion that the answer to the occupation is not in Israel. I mean, if you look at the structure of the government, if you look whether there's anybody there, any leader who has the political will and has the power to make changes, you become desperate. You say, no, this is hopeless. The hope for me is outside of Israel. I can see, just like in South Africa, just like in other places, the power of the international community, the power that can move Israel, is that for me is possible. And I see there is a change. I think there's certain things that give me hope, is to see young people today mobilizing for the environment, the social movements, and the solidarity with Palestinian movement is also part of that. I see some hope there. I think the reason in South Africa apartheid died was because at one point, for the middle class, the powerful class in South Africa, apartheid became bad for business. And I think at one point, if we can reach the point that the occupation becomes bad for business, when it hits people in their pockets, I think we can see a change. I may be dreaming, but that's my hope. That's the only thing.
Hashem. Rafi?
Yeah, I was just going to say, listening to what Yom was saying, I think change will happen. It always does. I mean, that's just the nature of the world we live in. Okay, nothing stays the same, nothing forever. And so where and when that change will come, nobody knows. But when the change does happen, I would not be surprised if it doesn't happen, that it happens very quickly. In other words, in some discussions that I've been involved in, the Palestinian Authority, the structure that was set up by the Rabin government in the mid-90s, et cetera, which is basically a collaborationist regime, that structure is very, very weak. And so, and the leadership of that structure is old and corrupt. And eventually, every old and corrupt leadership eventually will collapse. What will replace it, nobody knows. But that could be a catalyst for some major change. One thing I did want to mention, and you mentioned something on this, Leah, in the chat, is a book written by Jeff Halper called Decolonizing Israel-Palestine. And I know Jeff. I was involved with him in the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. I read his book and I highly recommend it. There's a roadmap that what Jeff talks about. And I've had some conversations with him not that long ago about, he really thinks that this can happen. And I went into that conversation highly skeptical, but read his book. I would recommend to everybody to read his book. And you want to start to think maybe something can happen. There needs to be some big catalyst before. Maybe it's the collapse of the PA. Maybe it's by some miracle, some government outside of Israel, as Yom was talking about, decides to finally take a moral stance against what is happening in Israel-Palestine. Something will happen, though.
Thank you, Rafi. And thank you, Miriam Meyer, for reminding us of Jeff Halper's great book, The Decolonization of Israel liberation for Palestine. Now, I wanted to reiterate Daphna's point that as Israelis, as Jewish people in relation to Israel and Palestine and settler colonialism everywhere, I don't think that we should, and I also don't think we have the right to give up hope and to give up action and to give up moving towards change that is moving towards equity. I think it's our responsibility. And I am so very, very grateful to our speakers today for coming here, sharing their difficult stories, bringing up difficult memories, and giving us all an example of what that work can look like. Please go to ijvcanada.org, click on the donate button, and I will pass it now to Erin. And if everyone wants to just clap and thank our great speakers alone at home, the sound of solitary applause is better than nothing.